All right, so we're going to jump into my first video and the first sonnet that we're going to be doing this term. How can we tell it's a sonnet? Well, probably if you really are switched on, you'll look at the title, which is Sonnet 18. Shakespeare, we know this is a Shakespearean sonnet. We know it's an English sonnet. How can we tell that? Well, let's take a look here. We look at the last couplet. That's a dead giveaway. We see a couplet. GG would be the rhyme scheme here. Had we already gone through the end rhyme and looked at it, labeled it with A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, and then finally GG. That's the rhyming couplet at the end, which is a dead giveaway. And we know that the difference between an Italian and an English sonnet is the structure. Italian sonnets using the octave sestet with a volta separating the two. English sonnets using 3 quatrains and a couplet. For those of you who are unclear about how to determine the type of sonnet you're reading, look at my other video on sonnets, and I'll give you a show on how to do that, or explain it to you. All right, so we're going to dive into this sonnet. Shakespeare begins the sonnet with a rhetorical question, and we know what a rhetorical question is. It's either a question that's asked in the answering, or a question that is immediately answered afterwards by the speaker himself. Here we have, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Now it's interesting that he uses the word shall here, which itself is a word that is really quite a civilized word. He could have used a few different words in here. He could have used could, might, can, will. All of these words change the meaning slightly. Shall is something that one might associate with someone putting their manners on or being quite civil. And the question is, who is he addressing? Questions normally are addressed either, to oneself or to someone else, right? In this case, you have a speaker, and on the other side, you have an object. And this is the person that the poem is about, the object of the poem. And what's interesting, too, is that he uses the word thee. It's a lowercase thee, not an uppercase thee. So it might suggest equality among the two. Or perhaps not a tremendous class difference between the speaker and the object. But it also suggests that there is some distance between the speaker and the object of the poem. So perhaps maybe he's not quite as familiar as he might like to be, or that they might eventually be. And you'll sort of get my meaning as we move through the poem. Now, he asks, shall I compare? And for our purposes here, we're going to assume that the object of the poem is a woman. And we'll get into my rationale or reasoning a bit later. So he says, can I compare you, or shall I compare you to a summer's day? So he's asking for permission or for leave to do that. But he really doesn't wait for that permission, because he continues on and he says, I can't. And we'll look at that after. Summer's day is interesting too. Now I'm going to look at the bottom right quadrant of your screen here. You're going to see, I'm drawing a little circle here. These are 4 quadrants. And we have seasons in here. We have spring, we'll have summer, we'll have fall, and we'll have winter. Now each of these seasons, this agricultural sort of metaphor that people use for over and over again, you'll find that we're going to be addressing this constantly during the year. So I really want you to become intimately familiar with this. Each of these seasons is sort of associated with a phase of life. So we're going to look at spring as really a time of birth or rebirth, depending on how you look at it. Summer is a time of full life. It is where you're fully adult. You're entered that phase in life where my pen's cutting out there. Hopefully that'll reappear, the F. There we go. Fall is a time of decline. And finally, winter is a time of death or dormancy. And so the way to move around that cycle here is you move from one phase to the other, and the wheel goes this way, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So he asks, can I compare you to a summer's day? Now, the idea of the summer's day as a metaphor for comparison is very Petrarchan. It is the chief season and the chief day in the season. So he's really looking at comparing her to a perfect summer's day. Now, we know that Petrarch, in the use of the metaphor, with his conceits that he would use, is he would take a woman, and what he would do is he would add a metaphor, method of comparison, There you go. He had a metaphor. And what he would do is that metaphor would increase her in status or value or stature. Um, and so the metaphors that he would often use, the objects of comparison would be, the chief metal, gold, the chief gem would be a diamond, the chief fabric, silk, the chief ivory, uh, you know, or ebony, very exotic wood, these sorts of things. And so it would never be second best. It would always be the best thing. So let's get rid of that for a moment here. I'm going to quickly just erase that. I'm going to need that space. Okay, so he asked the question, can I compare you to a summer's day? And the answer, simply put, is no. And why? Because she is more lovely and more temperate. And this is quite interesting. So he's saying no. And implicit in that no is that summer falls short. So the best day of the year falls short as a metaphor for your beauty. And so what's interesting, though, is implicit in that is that really, ultimately, he should be flipping it around and he should be comparing her to a summer's day. No, but what does more lovely and more temperate mean? Well, more lovely, I think, is self-explanatory. She's more beautiful. She's more attractive in every way. But more temperate here is dealing here with character. So if you could imagine, that's our graph here. She's neither too hot nor too cold. So she doesn't have a tremendous fluctuation in her temperatures. Those temperatures really would be associated with mood. The four humors, the four personality types, choleric, sanguine, melancholic, or phlegmatic. And what's interesting, though, is later on we talk about Hamlet being very melancholic, someone who's choleric, very angry. She's not like that. In fact, she's the opposite of that. What she is she's very, if you imagine, even-tempered. So when one lives in a temperate climate, it's a climate that's very, very comfortable. It doesn't have a huge temperature swing, and it's very moderate, very mild. And so she herself is very mild. She would have been thought of as being very proper, so to speak. So now that he's established why he can't, that he can't compare her to a summer's day, because summer's inadequate, he's now going to list the reasons why summer falls short of being ideal. And so first of all, he's going to start with the rough winds here. So he starts with the rough winds and the shaking, the darling buds of May. And what's really, really interesting is if you go down here to May, let's go back down to the seasons, and you're going to ask yourself, well, where does that fit? Well, we know that the first month of summer is June, right? In fact, the summer starts with the longest, June 22nd, I think. So the solstice, and so we look at May as not being really a month normally associated with summer. So the question is if he's talking about like summer's day here, why does he bring in the month of May as a method of comparison? Well, he's alluding to an earlier time, and this here is in May, would be a time in the springtime, which is a time of youth. And he says the darling buds. So for those of you that are familiar with budding trees, we know that the buds emerge on the branches, and they are either the leaves, the budding leaves, or the budding flowers. Now, since he's using, the object of the poem is a female, he's most likely using the flower metaphor here for capturing the female beauty, right? And if you look at this idea of flowering here, it's often associated with youth, right? And we talk about, the idea of a budding young virgin, or her bloom has faded, so to speak, as she's getting older, and that really are metaphors for where on the cycle that a female person, a woman, might be. So, is she a girl? Is she a young girl? Is she a full a woman at the prime of her life, or is she in a period of decline? And so, he's suggesting perhaps maybe that rough winds really have an impact on youth, and that they can really resonate later in life. It would be the summer portion of her existence. Now, if you look here, as summer's lease, he switches now to summer's lease has all too short a date. What's interesting here is that he chooses the word summer's lease. Lease here is very key. And a lease really is something that is borrowed. When you lease something, it is for a finite term, and you don't own it. It goes back to its rightful owner. So that idea of leasing really multiplies that feeling of brevity for summer. That summer really has a short date, and normally people would look at summer as being very, very short to start out with. It, even though it's the same as every other season, it seems like winter drags on forever, and summer takes almost no time at all. So he's saying summer is too short. Well, it's also too hot here, because you get too hot the eye of heaven shines. And what's interesting here is you can connect hot to this idea of temperate. And so if you think hot, perhaps maybe it would be choleric. And so, that's sometimes too passionate, too choleric, too angry. But when it's not, it's dimmed. His gold complexion is dimmed. So in a sense, literally, it's cloudy. And but that could also mean other things, perhaps maybe masked or gloomy, right? So again, this idea of moodiness, and every fair from fair sometime declines. This idea of fair from fair, it's a word that really gives a lot of students trouble, but literally it's every beautiful thing from beauty. What does that mean? Well, beautiful things give birth to other beautiful things. Ugly things don't come from beautiful things, and beautiful things don't come from ugly things. But what he's saying, it doesn't matter what you are, how beautiful you are, and your lineage, you are going to decline. So there's going to be a downward progression, and it's really just whatever you want to call it, entropy, you want to call it Newton's fourth law, but we understand that things can't last forever. And if you look at the seasonal metaphor here, that cycle, the fullness of life is leading to decline, right? And how do things decline? Well, things decline two ways, and he outlines chance over here, this idea of chance, and then nature's changing course, this idea here. Now, the first one of chance here, that's really accident. Those unforeseeable things which can really impact beauty. And what's interesting, anyone who's done a run full tilt into a patio door will understand how accidents can impact beauty. On the other hand, changing course, that's a natural progression, and that's just nature's way. There's nothing you can do to stop or arrest it. You are marching to the grave. Literally, the moment you drop out of the womb, you're dying. So he's really establishing that this is what happens. Now, this is where Shakespeare, or the speaker, will bring in his shift. His shift with the word but. Now, it's really important that whenever you see a shift, you write about it. Remember the saying we have in class, shift happens, write about it. And so you see the shift. He says, but thy eternal summer will not fade. So really, he's saying that her eternal summer, her situation is markedly different from what he's outlined in the previous two quatrains. She's not going to decline. She's not going to fade. In fact, he is going to arrest her decline. So at the fullness of her life, he'll hit the pause button, so to speak, and she will no longer age, which of course is impossible. And not only will her eternal summer not fade, she won't lose possession of the fair thou owest. So we can connect that here. We've seen fair earlier here, used twice. And owest here, really we can connect that to leasing. So the thing is her beauty and youth is not borrowed. It's owned. She doesn't have to give it back when she dies or when she ages. And so that is different. It's like, well, how can he possibly do that? Well, not only does she not have to give her beauty back, that death himself here cannot brag that she wanders in his shade. Now let's take a look at the top left of the page here. I'm going to do a little doodle here. I'm a big fan of doodling, as many of you know. Not an awesome artist, but you'll probably see this figure a few times. Here's my Reaper, my Grim Reaper, or Death personified. Right? Now, Death is going to cast a shadow, so that's the shadow of death. And here we have the woman who is the object of the poem. Give her some big hair here, and okay. So there you go. The idea, though, is that Death can't brag that she's in his shade, in his shadow. When you're in Death's shadow, you're almost his, but she is elusive. He can't touch her. And so this is an allusion to that. But as well, we see some resonance with the 23rd Psalm here, Psalm 23. And it's an Old Testament psalm. Some of you may not be familiar with it. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. And this idea of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, where death casts a shadow, it's a very oppressive, foreboding place. But you're okay because you know what? The shepherd is there. He's got his rod. He's got his staff. He's protecting you. He's guiding and protecting you. And so you're okay. So death can't brag that this woman is wandering in. So not only is he able to stop her decline, but he's also able to grant her immortality. You see, and he gives us this indication here with the idea of eternal lines. These eternal lines. So now we bring this to the concept of eternity here, which is we're really connecting to eternal summer. Well, but the eternal lines to time thou growest. So here, in this line, she's not only not declining, but rather she is reversing that progression. So let's take a look at our seasonal metaphor here on the bottom right, and she is reversing this idea of decline. She's becoming, in a sense, more beautiful, more valuable, more whatever you want to call it. So she's growing. Okay, that's interesting. So how is this possible? Well, how it's possible, and this is where Shakespeare gets a little cheeky here, is in this last couplet. What he does here is, the question he raises is eternal lines. What are those lines? Well, he answers that question implicitly. He says, so long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So we see this idea of the this here being connected to lines. And this idea is that the focus of the poem shifts here. He's saying that the poetry itself has the power to immortalize. And what's really important there, if you will, is that the poet here, has become godlike. And only God can grant immortality. So in a sense, what he's saying is that his poem, his writing, has the power to do what nothing else can. It can not only stop decline, that is a natural fact, natural progression of the universe, but it can actually reverse it and create immortality. So, in a sense, he says so long, but it's contingent on two things. It's contingent on the fact that people are breathing and seeing or reading his poem. It's a little bit full of himself when he talks about the fact that so long as human beings are alive, they're of course going to be reading his poetry. Well, for 400 years we have been. Who knows what the future will hold? But you kind of get a bit of a laugh here. But this is where the reversal comes in, and I want to show you what happens. See, this is our original shift here that we were talking about. We were talking about the original shift with the word but here. I'm going to circle but. And here's where he takes the idea of the woman here, the object in the first two quatrains, and he says, this is what is natural, but you're not going to do this. And why are you not going to do this? Well, because the quatrain here tells us why. It says, so long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long live this, and this gives life to thee. But what ends up happening here is there's a more subtle shift here in the couplet. He's saying that, what is the object of the poem ultimately? Is it the woman, or, as I like to look at it, is it the poem? See, I like to see Shakespeare not writing about a woman. The woman herself is sort of incidental to the poem. It's really the focus of his poem is his ability, his godlike ability to grant immortality through his verse. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to tackle it. So he's taken a traditional Petrarchan metaphor, which is the summer's day, right? Gone through, dismantled it, and then not only has he dismantled it, he's actually changed direction